The Forgotten Beauty. The grand palace of Zarkonia stood tall, its metallic walls gleaming under the light of 1,000 stars. Inside its vast halls, servants moved silently, their eyes downcast, afraid to meet the gaze of the once-adored Queen Lariel. She stood alone on the high balcony, her small, delicate frame barely visible against the vastness of the alien sky. Her shimmering green skin, once the pride of the Zarkonian Empire, now seemed to dull under the weight of rejection. Lariel had once been the prized jewel of the alien king, her beauty unmatched across the galaxies. The king had chosen her as his queen, proclaiming that her grace would symbolize the strength of his reign. But that admiration faded quickly when she could not bear the heir he so desperately wanted. To him, her worth had vanished, and now she was nothing more than a shadow in the palace. The palace buzzed with activity, but no one spoke to her. The servants, who once showered her with attention, now acted as if she didn't exist. She watched as they scurried about, preparing for yet another grand event. The king was rumored to be seeking a new queen, one who could give him what Lariel could not. She tightened the thin shawl around her shoulders, the cool night air biting at her skin. From her vantage point, she could see the endless city lights of Zarkonia stretching to the horizon. But even the beauty of the city felt empty to her now. Each light reminded her of what she had lost. Her thoughts were interrupted by faint whispers from the lower levels of the palace. She leaned over the railing, trying to catch the words. The voices spoke of humans, strange creatures from a distant planet who had dared to enter Zarkonian space. Humans, one voice hissed. They're growing bold. They think they can challenge us. They're nothing but pests, another replied. The king isn't worried about them. But Lariel could sense something different in the whispers. There was fear hidden beneath the arrogance. The Zarkonians considered themselves superior to all other species, yet humans seemed to unsettle them. Lariel had heard stories of humans before. They were smaller than most alien species, weaker and less advanced. Yet they had something the Zarkonians lacked, a fierce determination, a refusal to give up even in the face of impossible odds. The idea intrigued her. As the whispers faded, Lariel's curiosity grew. What kind of creatures were these humans? What made them so different? For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of interest, a small flicker of hope. She turned away from the balcony and wandered back inside, her bare feet silent against the cold, smooth floors. The grand halls were adorned with golden sculptures and glowing crystals, yet they felt hollow. Her reflection in the mirrored walls stared back at her, a beautiful, delicate figure, but one that felt trapped and powerless. Late that night, as the palace grew quiet, Lariel couldn't sleep. Her mind was restless, filled with questions about the humans. She slipped out of her chambers and wandered toward the lower levels, where the whispers had come from earlier. As she moved through the shadowy corridors, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. She stopped, her heart racing. Who else would be awake at this hour? Peering around the corner, she saw a figure moving carefully through the storage area. It was small, much smaller than any Zarkonian. A human. He wore a simple suit that looked worn and patched. His movements were quick and calculated as he searched through the supplies. Lariel's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen a human before, and something about him fascinated her. The human didn't notice her as he moved closer. His eyes scanned the shelves, and his hands reached for a small glowing object. It looked like a tiny hologram device. But as he grabbed it, it slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor, stopping near Lariel's feet. For a moment, their eyes met. The human froze, his gaze filled with caution but not fear. Lariel slowly bent down and picked up the device. The hologram flickered to life, showing a vibrant image of a planet. Blue oceans, green lands, and sparkling cities. Earth. The human gestured carefully, as if asking for the hologram back. But Lariel didn't move. She stared at the image, mesmerized by its beauty. It was so different from Zarkonia. There was life in those images, a sense of freedom she had never felt here. Before she could decide what to do, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. The human's eyes widened in alarm. Without a word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Lariel alone with the hologram in her hand. As she returned to her chambers, she couldn't stop thinking about the human or the image of Earth. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, a longing for something more, a life beyond the cold walls of the palace. She didn't know it yet, but this small encounter would change everything. A shadow in the dark. The night in Zarkonia was eerily quiet. The twin moons hummed low, casting silver light over the towering spires of the palace. A thin mist curled through the lower city streets, and the only sound was the distant hum of energy fields powering the outer defenses. Lariel couldn't sleep. She paced the balcony, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had replayed the whispers of the guards over and over again in her mind. Humans, why did the mention of them feel important? She sighed, stepping back inside her chambers. The silk curtains fluttered slightly as a cool breeze drifted through the open window. Zarkonia was one of the most advanced empires in the galaxy. No species had ever dared to challenge it, yet there was something about these humans that felt different. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a soft clatter, like metal striking stone. She froze, listening intently. The sound came from below, near the palace gardens. Lariel crossed the room swiftly and pressed her hands against the glass, peering down. A shadow moved along the palace wall. It wasn't the sleek, armored form of a Zarkonian guard. The figure was smaller, its movements cautious but quick. A human. Her heart quickened. The figure slipped through the shadows, stopping to inspect crates and supplies left near the outer gate. He was alone, but his presence felt bold, as if he had nothing to fear. Lariel leaned against the balcony railing, watching silently. The human wasn't stealing valuables or weapons. Instead, he rummaged through what looked like simple supplies, water canisters, food packs, spare tools. This wasn't a thief. Suddenly, the human stepped into a patch of moonlight, and Lariel saw him clearly for the first time. His clothes were worn and patched in several places. His hair was short and messy, and his face held a look of quiet focus. There was a certain calmness about him, something steady and grounded. As he knelt to open a crate, something slipped from his belt and clattered to the stone floor. Lariel's eyes caught the faint blue glow of the object as it rolled a few feet away. It stopped right beneath her balcony. The human froze. He looked up, scanning the balcony nervously, but Lariel remained hidden behind the curtains. Curiosity got the better of her. She stepped out quietly and knelt to pick up the object. It was a small round device, a hologram projector. When she pressed the button, an image flickered to life above her hand. A planet. Earth. Blue oceans stretched across the projection, dotted with green continents and bright cities glowing in the night. She had seen many planets before, but there was something about Earth that felt alive. The human below watched her carefully. He didn't speak, but his eyes held an unspoken request. Lariel hesitated. She could call the guards. One word, and the intruder would be caught. But she didn't. Instead, she slowly leaned over the railing and extended the hologram toward him. The human stepped forward and took it gently from her hand, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was no fear, only quiet gratitude. Before either of them could speak, the distant sound of boots echoed through the gardens. Zarkonian guards were making their rounds. The human's eyes flickered with urgency. He tucked the hologram into his belt, gave Lariel one last nod, and disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had come. Lariel stayed at the balcony, watching the spot where he had vanished. She didn't know why she had helped him. Perhaps it was the way he moved, so unlike the arrogant Zarkonian nobles, or perhaps it was the image of Earth, a place far from the cold, empty corridors of the palace. As she returned to her chambers, she held on to that small flicker of curiosity. The human had come and gone, but something about him lingered in her mind. She didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter had planted a seed, one that would soon grow into something far greater than she could imagine. The meeting of two worlds. The next night, Lariel found herself standing at the balcony again. The palace felt colder, emptier somehow, even as the city below shimmered with life. Her thoughts drifted back to the human. She had expected to forget about him by morning, but his quiet eyes and the image of Earth lingered in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. She scanned the garden below, but the shadows were still. The human wouldn't return, she told herself. Why would he? His presence here was dangerous. If the guards had seen him, he wouldn't have made it out alive. And yet, a faint rustling broke the silence. Lariel's breath caught as she peered over the railing. There he was, moving carefully through the undergrowth, just as he had the night before. This time, he seemed more cautious, his eyes constantly flicking toward the palace walls. He was looking for something. Lariel didn't hesitate. She slipped quietly down the grand staircase that spiraled into the lower levels of the palace. Her heart pounded with each step, but she pressed on. This was reckless, dangerous even, but something deep inside urged her forward. By the time she reached the garden's edge, the human was crouched near a storage crate, carefully inspecting tools. He hadn't noticed her. Lariel stepped into the moonlight, letting her presence be known. His head shot up, and he instinctively reached for his side, but stopped short when he recognized her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lariel studied him carefully, noting the exhaustion in his features. His clothes were worn thin, patched with scraps of different materials, and a small cut marked the side of his face. This wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was just surviving. Slowly, Lariel stepped forward and held out her hands in a gesture of peace. The human's shoulders relaxed, but his eyes remained cautious. "You're not supposed to be here," Lariel said softly, though she doubted he understood her. The human tilted his head slightly, as if trying to catch the meaning of her words. After a pause, he tapped a small device on his wrist. A soft hum followed, and his voice echoed faintly through the translator. "I'm not here to steal," he said, his voice low and calm. "I just need supplies. I'll leave soon." Lariel's gaze drifted to the bruises along his arms and the thin layer of dirt covering his hands. Supplies wouldn't be enough. He wouldn't last long in this sector, not with the patrols increasing every day. She didn't know why she cared, but something about him felt different. "There are better places to hide," she said, her voice softer now. "The palace isn't safe for you." The human hesitated. He looked at the palace towers rising behind her, then back at her with quiet curiosity. "And yet, you're here too." Lariel's expression faltered. He was right. She wasn't safe here either, not truly. The palace had become a cage, and the longer she stayed, the tighter the bars felt around her. "I don't have a choice," she replied, her eyes lowering slightly. The human seemed to study her carefully. After a moment, he reached into his pack and pulled out the small hologram projector she had returned the night before. He pressed the button, and Earth flickered to life once more. "This," he said, holding the projection between them, "this is my home." Lariel's eyes fixed on the image. She could almost feel the warmth radiating from the glowing cities and the peaceful blue of the oceans. It felt so far from the cold, dark metallic world she knew. "Is it as beautiful as it looks?" she asked. The human's lips curved slightly in a faint smile. "More." For a brief moment, Lariel forgot where she was. She imagined standing on Earth, beneath skies that weren't laced with energy shields or looming towers. A place where she wasn't just a forgotten queen. "Why did you come here?" Lariel asked. The human smile faded. "My people. We were driven from our colonies. Some of us escaped, but others." He trailed off, his gaze hardening. "The Zarkonians don't leave much behind." Lariel's heart tightened. She knew what he meant. The Empire's conquests had left scars across countless planets. She had heard the stories. but hearing them from someone who had lived it was different. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The human gave a small nod, but there was no bitterness in his expression, only quiet resilience. A distant hum broke the silence. Lariel's eyes flicked toward the palace gates. A patrol drone hovered in the distance, its sensors scanning the outer grounds. "They're searching," Lariel said urgently. "You need to go." The human hesitated, but Lariel gestured toward a hidden pathway along the edge of the garden. "This way," she said firmly. He followed her without question. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows until they reached the far edge of the palace grounds. The human paused at the exit, turning to meet her gaze once more. "Thank you," he said softly. Lariel nodded, but as he disappeared into the night, she felt something shift within her. The palace suddenly felt smaller, and for the first time in years, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Escape from the palace. The palace walls loomed taller than usual as Lariel stood in the shadows of her chambers, gazing out at the distant stars. It had been 3 nights since she last saw the human. 3 long nights where silence hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She told herself she shouldn't care. He was gone, far beyond the reach of the Zarkonian patrols. But still, her eyes drifted toward the garden each evening, half expecting to see his silhouette moving through the shadows. Tonight was different. The palace buzzed with quiet preparations. Servants whispered as they passed her door, casting nervous glances. The alien king had chosen a new queen. Lariel's replacement was already on her way, escorted by a fleet of royal ships. And Lariel, she would be sent away, far from the palace she once called home. A ceremonial outpost, they said, a place where forgotten queens lived out the rest of their days in silence. She couldn't let that happen. The decision had bloomed quietly in her mind, but now it pulsed louder with every passing hour. The palace was no longer her home. Her time here was over, and somewhere out there, among the stars, was a place she could start over. The human had found a way in. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out. The corridor outside her chambers stretched empty. The guards rarely patrolled this wing at night. Lariel wrapped a dark cloak around her shoulders, pulling the hood low over her face, and slipped quietly through the grand halls. She knew the palace like the back of her hand, the hidden pathways, the servants' entrances, the forgotten corridors no one used anymore. These halls had once been her playground, but tonight, they were her escape route. She moved swiftly but silently, each step calculated. The soft glow of crystal torches lined the walls, casting long shadows that flickered as she passed. As she neared the lower levels, a faint metallic hum vibrated through the floor. Patrol drones hovered nearby. Lariel pressed herself into a narrow alcove, waiting as the glowing red sensors scanned the hallway. The drone hovered for a moment longer than usual, its artificial eye lingering near her hiding spot. Lariel held her breath, feeling her heartbeat quicken. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the drone floated away, vanishing around the corner. Lariel exhaled softly and continued forward. At the far end of the corridor, she reached the garden gate, the very place she had first met the human. The night air was cold, but she felt relief wash over her as she stepped into the open space. The garden stretched before her, a sea of silver under the twin moons. But she wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the shadows near the palace wall. Her heart skipped. It was him. The human stepped forward cautiously, as if unsure whether to believe what he was seeing. His eyes met hers beneath the hood, and recognition sparked in his gaze. "You're leaving," he said quietly, though his tone held more surprise than certainty. Lariel nodded. "I have no reason to stay." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the leaves of the alien flora around them, and somewhere far off, the faint hum of patrol ships echoed through the city. "Come with me," the human said. Lariel hesitated. She had expected to leave alone, to find her own path somewhere far from the reaches of the Zarkonian Empire. "Where would we go?" she asked, her voice soft. The human glanced toward the distant horizon, where faint stars blinked against the dark sky. There's a transport ship hidden just outside the city limits. A few of us. We've been gathering supplies, waiting for the right moment to leave this planet. And Earth? Lariel asked. The human's eyes softened at the mention of his homeworld. It's far, but we'll get there. The garden felt smaller now, the palace walls tightening around her as if urging her forward. Lariel took a step closer, her decision solidifying with each breath. I'm coming with you, she said finally. The human's expression shifted to quiet relief. He nodded once, motioning for her to follow. They moved quickly through the outer gardens, keeping to the shadows. The palace walls stretched behind them, growing smaller with each step. The thought crossed Lariel's mind that this might be the last time she would see Zarkonia's grand towers piercing the sky. But as they reached the outer perimeter, alarms suddenly blared through the night. The human froze. They know, he muttered under his breath. Lariel's pulse quickened. Guards poured out from the side gates, their armor glinting under the moonlight. Red warning lights flashed across the palace walls, illuminating the entire garden. We have to move now, the human urged. They broke into a sprint, racing toward the narrow passage that led out of the city. Lariel's cloak billowed behind her as she kept pace, her feet light against the stone pathways. The guards shouted orders from behind, their heavy footsteps closing in. Energy rifles hummed as they powered up. A bright flash erupted as a bolt of plasma struck the ground just inches from Lariel's feet. She stumbled but pressed forward, the exit growing closer. The human reached the hidden passage first, holding the entrance open for her. Go, he shouted. Lariel dove through the narrow opening, and the human followed, sealing the stone barrier behind them. The muffled shouts of guards faded as they slipped into the quiet tunnels that led beyond the palace walls. As they emerged into the open plains outside the city, Lariel finally glanced back. The palace glowed in the distance, but for the first time, it didn't feel like home. Beside her, the human smiled faintly. Welcome to freedom. And as they walked beneath the starlit sky, Lariel felt lighter than she had in years. Trust in the unknown. The vast plains of Zarkonia stretched endlessly beneath the cold night sky. The palace, once looming and inescapable, now stood far behind them, its towers fading into the horizon like distant ghosts. Lariel walked in silence beside the human, the soft crunch of their footsteps the only sound between them. Her heart still pounded from the escape. The alarms had faded, but she knew the alien king wouldn't stop searching for her. Queens didn't just vanish. The human carried a small bag slung over his shoulder, filled with supplies he had managed to gather. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years on the run. What's your name? Lariel asked, breaking the silence. The human glanced at her, as if surprised by the question. Elias, he said simply. Lariel nodded. She had never heard a name like that before. Human names sounded strange to her ears, short, direct, unlike the elaborate titles the Zarkonians cherish. Lariel, she offered in return. Elias gave a slight nod. I know. Her brow furrowed. You do. I overheard the guards, he replied. They spoke of you often. The queen who couldn't bear the king's child. Lariel's steps faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. She had long grown used to those whispers. They're right, she said softly. Elias slowed his pace, his gaze flicking toward her. Maybe, he said, but that's not why I remember you. Lariel looked at him curiously. The night you found me in the garden, Elias continued, you could have called the guards. You didn't. I don't know why I didn't, she admitted. Something about you felt different. Elias let out a small chuckle. I get that a lot. They walked for hours, the open plains eventually giving way to rocky hills and dense foliage. The stars above shifted as the night wore on, and the moons began to sink below the horizon. We're not far now, Elias said, pointing toward the faint outline of a jagged cliff in the distance. There's a cave just beyond those rocks. We've been hiding our ship there. We? Lariel asked. Elias nodded. There are 3 others. Humans like me. We've been gathering supplies for weeks, waiting for the right time to leave this sector. A flicker of doubt crept into Lariel's mind. She barely knew Elias, and now she was walking into the unknown, trusting strangers she had never met. Elias must have sensed her hesitation because he slowed his pace and glanced at her. I get it, he said. Trusting someone you barely know isn't easy. Lariel remained quiet. You didn't have to come with me, Elias added. But you did. That's got to mean something. She met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of deception. But there was none. His eyes were calm, steady, and filled with the kind of quiet determination she had never seen in the Zarkonian nobles. For the first time in a long while, Lariel chose to believe in someone. The path narrowed as they approached the cliffs. Dense vines hung over the rocky walls, and a narrow gap led into a dark, hollow cave. Elias ducked beneath the overgrowth, motioning for Lariel to follow. Inside, the air grew cooler, and the faint hum of machinery echoed from deeper within. As they rounded a bend, Lariel's eyes widened. A small, worn transport ship sat nestled in the heart of the cave. Its surface was patched in several places, and faint scorch marks lined the edges, but it was intact. Beside it, 3 figures stood talking quietly. They stopped the moment they saw Elias enter. One of the humans, a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a braid, stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed as they landed on Lariel. Elias, the woman said cautiously. Who is this? She helped me, Elias replied. She's coming with us. The woman folded her arms. We can't take her. You know what will happen if they find out we. She doesn't have anywhere else to go, Elias interrupted, his voice firm. The woman's eyes flickered toward Lariel again. There was distrust there, but something else too, a flicker of recognition. She's the queen, isn't she? One of the others whispered. Lariel straightened slightly, feeling the weight of their stares. Not anymore, she said quietly. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, the tall woman let out a breath and gave a reluctant nod. Fine. But if she causes trouble, she won't, Elias said confidently. Lariel met the woman's gaze and offered a small nod. Thank you. The tension eased slightly, and the humans returned to their tasks, preparing the ship for launch. Lariel stood beside Elias, watching as the engines powered up with a soft hum. Will this ship really make it to Earth? She asked. Elias smiled faintly. It's gotten us this far. That's good enough for me. For the first time in years, Lariel felt something stir within her, hope. As the ship's engines roared to life, the cave walls trembled and the night sky opened before them. The stars stretched endlessly, but this time they felt closer. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. Earth's promise. The worn transport ship shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere of the small blue planet. Lariel sat by the narrow window, watching in quiet awe, as Earth unfolded beneath her. Vast oceans stretching endlessly, patches of green land scattered like jewels, and clusters of light flickering across the surface as the planet rotated slowly below. It's beautiful, she whispered. Elias, seated beside her in the cramped cockpit, smiled faintly. Wait until you see it up close. The journey had been long. Weeks spent drifting through the cold expanse of space, avoiding Zarkonian patrols and rogue scavengers. Supplies had grown thin, and the tension on board often felt heavy. But they had made it. Earth, a place she had only glimpsed in flickering holograms, was now real and within reach. As the ship descended, Lariel's mind raced with questions. Would she be accepted here? Would humans look at her the same way the Zarkonians did, with quiet judgment, as someone who had failed in her duty? Or would they see something different? The ship trembled again, but this time with the soft hum of landing gear unfolding. A flat, grassy plain stretched before them as the vessel touched down gently, its engines hissing to a halt. Elias powered down the controls, glancing at Lariel. Nervous? Lariel nodded slightly. I haven't set foot on a new planet in years. Elias chuckled. Earth isn't as grand as the Zarkonian Empire, but it's home. The airlock hissed open, and a rush of cool, crisp air filled the ship. Lariel hesitated at the threshold, letting the unfamiliar sense wash over her, earthy, fresh, alive. Zarkonia's air had always smelled metallic, recycled by palace machines. This was different. Elias stepped out first, turning to offer his hand. Lariel hesitated for just a breath before accepting it. The ground beneath her feet felt soft and uneven, unlike the smooth metal floors of the palace. Grass. She bent down, running her fingers over the blades. It felt fragile yet vibrant, like the planet itself was alive beneath her touch. Welcome to Earth, Elias said. Lariel straightened, letting her gaze drift across the landscape. Rolling hills stretched out in the distance, and clusters of trees swayed gently in the wind. Farther away, she spotted faint smoke curling from chimneys. A village, perhaps. Small, but full of life. Is this where you grew up? She asked. Elias shook his head. No. My home was farther from here, but this is where we start over. The other 3 humans from the ship emerged behind them, already unloading supplies. They spoke quietly, sharing soft laughs and relieved sighs. The weight of the escape had lifted, and now there was only the quiet hum of possibility. A young boy, no older than 10, came running from the distant village. His bare feet kicked up dust as he hurried toward them. Elias knelt as the boy reached him, ruffling his hair. You're back. The boy beamed. We thought you weren't coming. I promised I would, Elias said warmly. The boy's curious gaze shifted to Lariel, his wide eyes taking in her green skin and delicate frame. Who's she? He asked innocently. Lariel felt a brief flicker of discomfort, but Elias simply smiled. She's a friend. The boy nodded, accepting the answer without hesitation. You can come to the village. Everyone's nice there. Lariel's heart softened at his words. The simplicity of his acceptance caught her off guard. There was no judgment, no questioning of her past. As the boy led them toward the village, Lariel found herself walking slower, letting her surroundings sink in. Birds soared overhead, their songs unfamiliar but soothing. Wind rustled through the leaves, and the faint scent of flowers drifted through the air. For the first time in years, Lariel felt peace. The village was small but lively, with people moving between modest homes and market stalls. A group of children laughed as they played by a shallow stream, splashing water at one another. Others worked in the fields, tending to crops under the midday sun. Elias introduced Lariel quietly to those they passed. The villagers greeted her with curious but warm smiles. There were no bows, no elaborate titles, just simple nods and genuine welcomes. By evening, the village square was filled with chatter and laughter as the newcomers were embraced fully. Lariel sat by the fire, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. A young girl approached, holding out a small woven bracelet. For you, the girl said shyly. Lariel accepted it gently, slipping it onto her wrist. Elias sat beside her, watching the flames flicker. I told you, he said softly, Earth is different. Lariel smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the fire. For years, she had lived in a palace of cold metal, surrounded by walls that whispered of failure. But here, under the stars of a new world, there were no expectations, no crowns or thrones. Only the quiet hum of life and the promise of something more. Lariel tilted her head back, watching the stars blink in the sky. Perhaps she wasn't meant to be a queen. Perhaps she was meant to be free. A new beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet village. The air was cool, filled with the scent of burning wood and wildflowers carried by the evening breeze. The small stream that curved through the heart of the village reflected the fading light, rippling gently as children splashed along its edges. Lariel stood at the edge of the water, her bare feet sinking softly into the damp earth. The bracelet the young girl had given her still rested on her wrist, a simple but cherished gift. She twisted it between her fingers absent-mindedly, letting the sounds of the village wash over her. Laughter, footsteps, the distant hum of a windmill. It all felt so alive. It had been months since she arrived on Earth. In that time, the fear that had gripped her heart during their escape had faded, replaced by something unfamiliar yet comforting. Peace. Elias approached quietly, his footsteps light against the grass. He carried 2 bowls of stew, the steam curling into the cool evening air. He handed one to Lariel, sitting beside her on a large, smooth stone by the water's edge. "You seem quiet tonight," Elias said, stirring his food slowly. Lariel smiled faintly. "I'm not used to this." "To what?" She gestured to the village. "All of it. The quiet, the warmth, the feeling that no one expects anything from me." Elias chuckled softly. "That's Earth for you. Simple, but it grows on you." Lariel took a small sip of the stew. The flavors were rich but humble, made from local herbs and vegetables. It was a far cry from the lavish feasts served at the Zarkonian palace, yet it felt more satisfying somehow. "You know," Elias began after a moment, "no one here cares about the titles you once had. To them, you're just Lariel." She glanced at him. "That doesn't bother me." "Good." Elias set his bowl aside, leaning back on his hands to gaze up at the stars. "Because this is the best version of you I've seen." Lariel followed his gaze, watching the constellations slowly drift across the night sky. "The stars here look different, brighter, more hopeful." "I thought I'd feel lost," Lariel admitted. "After everything, I thought I'd always feel like a stranger here." Elias smiled but said nothing. In the distance, the village lights flickered as torches were lit along the pathways. Families gathered in their homes, and the soft hum of evening stories and songs drifted through the air. A group of children ran past, chasing fireflies along the stream. One of the boys, a younger version of Elias, perhaps stumbled and fell near Lariel's feet. He looked up at her, wide-eyed, before scrambling to his feet with a sheepish grin. "Sorry, miss," he said, before darting off after his friends. Lariel watched them go, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. "They don't see you as different," Elias said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "To them, you're just part of the village now." "I didn't expect that," she replied softly. "You don't have to be a queen to matter," Elias said. "Sometimes, being part of something small, it's enough." Lariel set her bowl aside and let out a long breath. She had spent years living under the weight of expectations. The alien king had chosen her for her beauty, her status, things that in the end hadn't mattered. But here, in this quiet village on a distant planet, no one cared about her appearance or what she could offer. They cared about her as a person. It was a strange and humbling realization. As the stars continued their slow journey across the sky, Lariel felt the weight she had carried for so long finally begin to lift. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't useless. She was free. Elias rose to his feet, offering her his hand. "Come on," he said. "They're lighting the festival lanterns tonight. You should see it." Lariel hesitated for only a moment before slipping her hand into his. As they walked back toward the village, the light from the lanterns grew brighter, and the soft hum of voices filled the air. For the first time in her life, Lariel wasn't walking toward a throne or a title. She was walking toward something far more precious: home.